Good evening and welcome to the forum at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. We are indeed privileged and honored to have with us this evening, back with us, Ambassador Paul Nitze, who will speak on East-West relations on the verge of a new era. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Kennedy School's Center for Science and International Affairs and by the Institute of Politics. Many of you will remember Ambassador Nitze's eloquent address at last year's CSIA Strategy and Arms Control Seminar when he spoke about the nuclear and space talks and the Reagan legacy. A few of you may remember Paul Nitze when he was a Harvard undergraduate, class of 1928. Ambassador Nitze, diplomat in residence at the newly renamed Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, has advised every president since Franklin Roosevelt. As many of you will know, his famous 1950 memorandum to President Truman, called NSC 68, has served as the conceptual foundation of post-war U.S. security policy. Paul Nitze served as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration until November 1963, when President Kennedy appointed him Secretary of the Navy. He served at that post and later as Deputy Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson. From 1969 until 1974, he was the Pentagon's representative on the U.S. delegation to the SALT talks with the Soviet Union, and in that capacity, Ambassador Nitze was a principal architect of the ABM Treaty of 1972. A few years and a walk in the woods later, Ambassador Nitze was serving as the chief negotiator for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces talks in Geneva and as President Reagan's arms control guru. His work ultimately culminated in the seminal superpower treaty to withdraw and destroy all U.S. and Soviet INF missiles. In 1985, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contribution to the freedom and security of the United States. And he was named Ambassador at Large the following year, the position in which he served until his retirement last year. He's just published his memoirs, From Hiroshima to Glasnost, at the Center of Decision. Of all of his experiences and accomplishments, however, I'm told that Ambassador Nitze is especially proud of his current state of fitness. While horseback riding last year, Ambassador Nitze had a freak accident in which his horse fell on top of him, fracturing his pelvis. And at the time, doctors wondered if he would ever be able to walk again, much less ride horses. After what is considered a truly remarkable recovery, Ambassador Nitze was given total medical clearance a month ago, and he tells me that he's already been back on horseback and plans, in fact, to go skiing this winter. The case is, in fact, so incredible that it's recently been written up in a medical journal. Ambassador Nitze's address, after his address, there will be a question period which will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Joseph Nye, the director of the Center for Science and International Affairs. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you one of the great recuperators and one of the great strategists of our age, Paul Nitze.
Thank you, Dean Putnam, and particularly the compliments about my ability to recuperate and also to choose good doctors. They were absolutely superb doctors. But it's a pleasure to return again to this campus, to where I spent many years both as an undergraduate and unsuccessfully tried to get a graduate degree. But let me turn to my subject. And my subject, it is my view that the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the last few months can justly be called the revolution of 1989. It has had a long history. Much of that history is recorded in my book, From Hiroshima to Glasnost. But in my remarks this evening, I do not propose to talk about the book. I propose to focus on the new era that now approaches us, the changes in the Soviet Union and in Central Europe that are now unfolding, their background, the opportunities they open up, the dangers they could portend, and my tentative recommendations as to the positions we should take on the principle-related policy issues that now need answers. The genesis of the changes we are now seeing can be traced back to the last time we were on the verge of a new era, the days when the eventual defeat of Hitler began to seem probable, and a number of us in Washington began to think about the post-war world. We asked ourselves then, as we are asking today, what kind of relations among the nations of the world would we like to see established? There was, of course, much debate and disagreement. One difficult problem was how to treat Germany and Japan when they sued for peace. Some wanted vindictive terms. Others did not want to repeat the errors of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, whose injustices and unwisdom they saw as having been the principal cause of World War II. Many felt another crucial error after World War I had been the failure of the United States to back President Wilson's concept of a League of Nations. At their behest, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference was called in 1944 to begin the process of creating the United Nations. Subsequently, Dean Acheson and others addressed the creation of organizations to deal with a new world economic order, in particular the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, later to be supplemented by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. It was anticipated, however, that there would be a set of problems with which the United Nations and other international agencies would be unable to deal. One such problem was the growing rejection of the remnants of colonialism throughout the world. For the U.S. to apply its weight on these issues would offend our European partners and get us into issues for which we were ill-prepared. Thus, it was decided to rely on the British to deal with this and other similar problems. But the most serious question was how we should view our post-war relations with the Soviet Union, for it was evident by that time that the two world wars had shattered the dominant position of Europe in the world and had left the U.S. and the USSR as the two major powers. It was also apparent that Hitler's defeat would remove the cause of our alliance with the Soviets and make cooperation with this Leninist state, dominated by a ruthlessly totalitarian and expansionist dictator, much more difficult. The majority view was that despite all the obvious difficulties, we must exhaust every possibility of preserving our alliance with the Soviet Union into the peace, lest we begin down the road towards serious confrontation and eventually a third world war. Thus, the three pillars of post-war policy became: 1, helping build the United Nations and associated agencies; 2, looking to the United Kingdom to manage international problems that could not be handled by the UN; and 3, attempting to work out a modus vivendi with the USSR despite the difficulties involved. By 1947, however, it became evident that none of the three pillars had any chance of success. With continuing opposition from the USSR and the use by the Soviets of their veto in the Security Council, the UN was becoming largely a forum for public debate. It had effectively lost any influence on matters where East and West disagreed. It had gradually become apparent that the United Kingdom had been so drained in its material, military, and psychological resources by its heroic stand during the two world wars that it could no longer play the role our policy had envisaged for it. And the evidence was becoming overwhelming that Stalin and Molotov had no intention of collaborating with the West or of working out just and equitable arrangements in Europe. The Soviets insisted that their brand of communists achieve total power in Poland and that all opponents be effectively eliminated. They refused to negotiate a peace treaty covering all of Germany and insisted that all opposition to their stooges be suppressed in their zones of occupation in East Germany and Berlin. Eventually, the same fate overwhelmed Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and with less opposition, Bulgaria. In response to these developments, President Truman made several key decisions in February 1947 that radically shifted our policy toward the Soviet Union. In 1946, George Kennan had sent from our embassy in Moscow a report that became known as the Long Telegram. George had described Stalinist policy, its origins, its evils, and its dangers, and argued that Stalin's expansionism had become more powerful as it had fed upon its successes. It was his belief and mine that if we were successful in containing that expansionism, the Soviet people would eventually look inward and see what was happening to Russian institutions and culture and would withdraw their support for Stalinesque policies. By 1947, an increasing number of people were coming to share George's views. They were also becoming concerned about Soviet-inspired security threats to Greece and Turkey. When the British government informed the President that it could no longer bear the burden of supporting Greek and Turkish resistance to these threats, Mr. Truman decided that the U.S. should undertake the task. In short order, the Greek-Turkish aid program, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan were announced, and work began on the creation of NATO. The implementation of the policy of containment was put into place. To maintain this policy over the next 4 decades required great perseverance by the United States and our allies. Through the Korean War, crises in Berlin and Cuba, an extended Soviet attempt to achieve military superiority. The turning point in this long effort seems to me to have come in 1983, when NATO held fast and proceeded with the deployment of INF missiles to offset similar Soviet deployments, of INF missiles to offset earlier Soviet deployments, despite a concerted Soviet campaign to stop the NATO program, culminated by a Soviet walkout from the INF negotiations. Shortly thereafter, the policy of containment began to have its desired effect. Key Soviet leaders began to look inward. 3 or 4 years ago, Mikhail Gorbachev told some of us that even before he became Secretary General of the Communist Party, when serving on the Politburo under Andropov, he and his colleague Nikolai Ryzhkov began to examine what was wrong with the society the party had created. Its institutions, its practices, its economy, and its devotion to aggressive military capabilities. There was much that they did not like. They created teams of experts to plan the programs that became Glasnost and Perestroika and take a new look at Soviet military doctrine and requirements. The seeds of a new era were thus planted. Gorbachev began implementing changes soon after becoming Secretary General in 1985. At first, it appeared he intended only to make the existing system work more efficiently. But over time, probably because he learned that limited change was being outpaced by events, he turned to broader structural reforms. Did Gorbachev understand the significance of these changes? Probably not. He was able to exploit the reforms in a brilliant campaign to isolate and defeat his principal domestic opponents and to win political approval in the West. But I doubt he appreciated the breadth and strength of the forces unleashed or the difficulties he would face. The aims of Gorbachev's reforms seem to be several. To modernize the Soviet economy, primarily by introducing market forces. To restructure the Communist Party organization and its relationship to the government. Presumably to increase efficiency and the responsiveness of the ruling apparatus to the views of wider groups within the USSR. To deal sympathetically, but within strict limits, with nationalities seeking greater independence within the USSR and within the Warsaw Pact. To reduce the burden of military expenditure on the Soviet economy while maintaining fully adequate military capabilities through a combination of unilateral actions and arms control negotiations, and by reducing the appearance of a threat from the USSR to release the inherent centrifugal forces in the West and entice more significant assistance of various kinds from the outside world. Gorbachev's efforts to date to attain all but the last of these objectives have met with spreading failure. He has not been able to introduce market forces as he had originally planned. In the meantime, the economic situation in the USSR has radically worsened. A prerequisite to a healthy market is to have a reasonably stable medium of exchange, with a ruble exchange rate that reflects the true value of the currency. This has eluded him. He recently reduced the rate at which tourists could buy rubles for local purchases by a factor of 10 to a level that approximated the black market rate. But he left untouched the more important commercial transactions. In addition, leasing of agricultural land has not produced the anticipated results. And many of the commercial cooperatives seem to have led to corruption, creating serious political problems. Gorbachev's efforts to restructure the party and the government have had some success in increasing efficiency and responsiveness, but the system is still subject to his ultimate personal control. Without that ultimate control, the situation could well become unstable. The problems with internal nationalities have grown far beyond anything Gorbachev anticipated. And the limits he earlier put on the extent of reforms in Eastern Europe have been swept away by the political forces let loose by the discrediting of totalitarian communism. Gorbachev has been able to begin a process of reducing the burden of military expenditures while maintaining adequate military capabilities. But that adequacy depends on forces, or depends on military forces, whose reliability is being questioned in the light of the extraordinary political changes taking place. Perhaps Gorbachev's greatest success has been with regard to his objective of unleashing centrifugal forces in the West and eliciting external assistance. There are indeed those who are suggesting a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe, as well as those who are proposing a Marshall Plan to assist the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in making the transition from communism to systems with greater diversity and freedom. A crucial question is the extent to which Gorbachev continues to believe in communism as the essential ideology for the USSR. Everything he has said would indicate that he continues to cling to Marxism, Leninism, even though he has lost confidence in its more absolutist versions. Objective factors also make it difficult for a democratic political philosophy to get a toehold in the great Russian parts of the Soviet Union. There is no democratic heritage, no free market experience, and the spirit of entrepreneurism that in any case is rare in the Russian people has been pretty well eliminated over the last 3 generations. An authoritarian form of government may be necessary in the Russian parts of the Soviet Union to avoid chaos. There is even a strong sentiment among them in favor of a return to autocracy. In sum, Gorbachev and the rest of the Soviet leadership face immense problems, and his efforts to date to overcome these problems have, for the most part, fallen far short of success. In fact, these difficulties may prove insuperable. There has been much discussion lately of the possibility that Gorbachev might fail and be replaced as Soviet leader. Such an event might be tactically significant, but I believe no longer would be strategically significant. For any successor to Gorbachev would have to deal with today's situation, with the whole panoply of Soviet problems and the constraints on policy these problems create, much as Gorbachev will have to do if he continues in power. Given this radically changed and uncertain situation, what are the immediate policy questions and tasks facing us and our allies? I would suggest that the most difficult and also the most urgent objective is to demonstrate that states that have for some time been under the firm and destructive control of totalitarian communist regimes can successfully make the transition to free and successful governmental systems reasonably responsive to their people. Poland is the immediate problem, but Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia are not that far behind. Poland, because Catholicism was not successfully suppressed, is culturally pretty sound. Its political orientation toward the West is also established. But are there sufficient cadres to make non-centralized agriculture, commerce, and industry work? It will take much Western help to make success possible. The West Germans are already working hard at providing necessary help. But is there sufficient time before rampant inflation makes the task unmanageable? In any case, a policy of concerted Western assistance for Poland's efforts to overcome these problems merits wide support. Similarly, I see no great issue regarding our policy toward other Warsaw Pact states that are attempting, or may in the future attempt, the transition to market economies and representative governments. They deserve our help. But what should our response be if, despite the transition, they wish to remain members of the Warsaw Pact, whether to avoid Soviet disapproval and possible counteraction or some other considerations? I see little reason to object, as I don't believe they would give the Soviets such cooperation as would materially affect our or our allies' security interests. A new issue arises, however, with West Germany taking the lead, now with aid to Poland, and later with aid also to East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. This indicates a primary role for Germany, not only in respect to reunification, but more generally in Central Europe as a whole. How will the European community react to this development, and potentially a leading role for Germany in assistance to the Soviet Union itself? 3 weeks ago, the European community countries met in Paris at the invitation of President Mitterrand to discuss the possibility of German reunification. They all agreed, including Chancellor Kohl, that the time for German reunification had not yet arrived. For the time being, it was decided nothing should be done to alter borders, although future German aspirations should not be foreclosed. Within a week, political developments in both East and West Germany changed the scene so dramatically that Kohl altered his position. Now he accepts as inevitable some form of unity between the two Germanys. Kohl now says there should be no timetable toward this union, but he asserts that it will come to pass. The European community now appears to have given its approval. West Germany today is the strongest country on the continent economically, and next only to the Soviet Union in the field of non-nuclear military capabilities. With the unification of East and West Germany and the deployment and the development of close relations with the countries of Central Europe, Germany's position in the European community could well become dominant. How should we view this trend? It certainly calls for the most serious consideration. I doubt that the U.S. should or can effectively oppose it. The task of dealing constructively with burgeoning German power must largely be that of the Atlantic community as a whole, although there is a necessary role for the U.S. as well. Another difficult policy dilemma concerns our attitude toward those nationalities within the current boundaries of the Soviet Union that seek independence or greater autonomy. Here, our values come into conflict with our pragmatic interests. For while we rightfully support the aspirations of all nationalities for greater self-determination, we must also bear the great dangers that might arise should ethnic conflicts in the Soviet Union get out of hand. The possibility of chaos or civil war in a land where tens of thousands of extremely powerful nuclear weapons are stored is not to be taken lightly. There is no way to resolve this dilemma in a completely satisfactory manner. I would distinguish between the Baltic states and other nationality groups. The former were absorbed, contrary to their will, many years ago, and we have never considered their annexation to have been legitimate. To change that view now, in order to help Gorbachev survive, is, in my view, erroneous in principle and apt to be counterproductive in practice. Therefore, I disapprove of recent U.S. statements discouraging the Baltic states from pursuing independence at this time. I would recommend a more cautious attitude, however, toward the Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and other nationality groups. We should maintain our support for self-determination in general, but we should avoid giving encouragement to secessionist movements. The primary thrust of our policy should be to object on humanitarian grounds to any use of excessively harsh means to suppress these groups. What should be our policy toward Soviet attempts to restore their economy from its current breakdown? I do not believe that economic chaos in the USSR is in the interest of the Russian people, in our interest, or in that of our allies. This is an important part of the world with vast extent and a variety of talented peoples, many of them with a long history and ancient and productive cultures. Nevertheless, I would not recommend we provide extensive material economic aid at this time. Giving them contingent support for most favored economic treatment is quite a different matter. At some time in the future, it is likely that the Soviet part of the world will be economically so organized as to be able to take advantage of modern management and technical advances. If it were to achieve efficiencies, half of those now enjoyed by Western Europe, the United States, Japan, and much of East Asia, the per capita income of the population of the Soviet Union would be many times what it is today. But until those in charge in the Soviet Union cast off the ideological barriers that prevent them from accepting private ownership of land or of their homes and of small businesses, there is little prospect of economic revival. Aid, when there are ideological barriers to its proper use, is generally ineffective. Moreover, at the present time, there seems to be a movement within the Soviet Communist Party to move away from further reform and toward a reimposition of what they call communist discipline. There are indications that Gorbachev is threatening to reestablish his control over the media, and that many in the party are concerned about their ability to win at the polls and fear that the trends toward accommodating public opinion have gone too far. There was even a suggestion before Malta that Gorbachev might present to President Bush the reasons why greater discipline in the Soviet Union was necessitated by the objective situation and ask his understanding of the measures he might need to take. It seems to me unthinkable that we might give any support to a resumption of Soviet repressive measures. The issue, however, did not come up at Malta. On the question of stabilizing reductions of conventional forces in Europe, the policy of the West seems to me to need little, if any, change. NATO as an organization seems to be making progress in developing a coordinated position for the CFE talks, and the negotiations between NATO and the Warsaw Pact were converging toward what could be a useful agreement. But now, with many believing that the threat has become remote, differences among members of NATO have again come to the fore. Much diplomatic work within NATO needs to be done to keep CFE on the track. Of the arms control agreements currently under negotiation, a stabilizing START agreement is particularly important to the security of the United States. To achieve a truly stabilizing agreement means not only filling in all the holes that yet remain in the U.S. negotiating position, but also resolving several key issues within the Soviet Union at the political level. They have held up progress toward genuine stability for too long. In my view, it is my view that even if we were to conclude a START agreement along the lines we've been striving for some time, it would not provide adequate assurance of stability for the long term. There are some 30,000 nuclear weapons and thousands of delivery systems in the USSR. Our current position does not propose that any nuclear warheads be destroyed, or that there be cuts in destabilizing delivery systems of sufficient magnitude to provide confidence of long-term stability. The most threatening of the Soviet long-range nuclear systems are their heavy ICBMs. They are now modernizing those missiles with a new system called the SS-18 Mod 5. These will be the most modern, most destructive, and most potentially destabilizing systems in the world. Recently, Gorbachev has said that the tensions in Europe over the last decade were caused by an erroneous decision by him and the Soviet Union to deploy powerful missiles, i.e. the SS-20s, in the center of Europe without considering the anxiety such an action would cause to the continental European NATO countries. He said that it was his realization of that error and his recognition that the lesson applied more broadly that had caused him to propose unilateral reductions in conventional arms in Europe and much greater reductions if NATO were to agree to reciprocate. I believe we should now point out the analogy between the earlier Soviet era in deploying SS-20s in the center of Europe and their current era in insisting on maintaining and modernizing their heavy ICBMs. But we must recognize that it is unlikely that Gorbachev will agree to that. We should not lose sight of the dangerous forces that will remain if we succeed in concluding START and CFE agreements as now projected. As long as 30,000 large and potentially destabilizing nuclear warheads and long-range delivery systems exist in the Soviet Union, someone in the West will have to accept the task of deterring their use should the Soviet leadership become uncertain or irresponsible. That task will necessarily fall to the United States. No one else is apt to relieve us of the burden. If we are to carry that burden, there should be an organizational structure through which we consult with our allies concerning the steps we should take in maintaining the bottom line of our defense. NATO would appear to be the natural organization through which to conduct such consultation. Therefore, I think it is important that we and our allies resist any suggestion that NATO be disbanded regardless of whether the Warsaw Pact remains intact. There are other organizational questions as well. What is the framework within which the manifold issues of the new world facing all of us can best be handled? Today we have a rich panoply of political, economic, national security, regional, and other specialized organizations, within which a variety of relationships have arisen, both on a geographic and political basis. Which of these organizations are best suited to address arising problems, and how might they be altered to more effectively do so? One key organization is the European Community. Two models suggest themselves for the manner in which the EC might be adapted to the new era. One approach would be to develop the EC in depth, to become what would amount to a sovereign state, controlling not only the economic but also the political and military actions of its members. Alternatively, such integration might be restricted to a few members prepared so to do, while concurrently arrangements in greater geographic extent would be developed to take care of the special needs of other countries, including the United Kingdom, the Scandinavian countries, the neutrals such as Switzerland and Austria. I favor the latter model. The EC members 3 days ago appeared to have come to the same conclusion. Another useful organizational structure is the CSCE, which includes the non-aligned and the neutral European countries, as well as the Warsaw Pact and NATO nations. As the Warsaw Pact falls apart, the CSCE may have a more important role to play. Finally, let me address the more general policy question of how we should view Glasnost, Perestroika, and their originator, Mikhail Gorbachev. Should we wish for their success? If so, how much help should we be willing to provide to aid their success? I agree with those who argue that the success of Glasnost and Perestroika is to our interest, that it would likely lead in the long run to a more open, prosperous, less militaristic Soviet Union that evidenced greater respect for individual and national rights and played a more cooperative and less ideology-driven role in resolving international problems peacefully. But I also believe that our ability to influence the outcome is limited. As Gorbachev and his colleagues have stated on many occasions, the success of Perestroika depends on the Soviets themselves. Furthermore, I believe it would be a mistake to tie our policy too closely to a single individual. We tried that in Iran with the Shah and in China with Chiang Kai-shek. In both cases, it backfired badly. We should be positioned to deal effectively with Gorbachev's successor should a change of leadership occur. And as I indicated earlier, I believe that any successor would be forced by events to a foreign policy not too different from Gorbachev's. This derives from two factors. First, the force of many of the changes we've seen follow each other so dramatically over the last few months have created such an alteration in the world scene that Gorbachev or any Soviet leader will have to adjust to it. Second, any Soviet leader will be constrained by much the same panoply of internal problems that have so substantially influenced Gorbachev's policies. Nevertheless, we know Gorbachev and have had experience in dealing with him. Any successor would be bound to present great uncertainties. Therefore, we should welcome success for Gorbachev. But I also believe we are justified in exercising caution as we continue to explore the hopeful possibilities that currently exist. Thank you.
Well, as usual, Paul has given us his deep and insightful tour of the horizon, and we now turn to a period for questions. There are microphones in this aisle and this aisle on the ground floor and in the balcony, and we'll take the questions in order if people want to queue up behind the microphones, rotating between them. Let me remind you that a question is a brief statement with a question mark at an end. Or another way of putting it is there's only one speaker this evening. So let's start at this microphone.
I have a very brief question. Mr. Nisse, I was curious of your opinion that giving aid to Eastern Europe at this point would also be very much in the economic interest of the United States, in the sense that these are new market opportunities. There's been some discussion of this. I was wondering what your opinion of this is. Thank you.
I agree, but I would think that it's really a diminutive argument. You know, the amount that the Soviet Union can export to us is not very great. And in fact, it's very hard to see that they can export anything much other than furs and a few things like that. So I don't really see that there's a great market there. But I don't think that bears much on the idea that we should do the best we can. It's most important from the standpoint of helping the Soviets meet their problem of recovery, much more so than of adding markets for the United States.
Thank you.
The report this week of the Iraqis using a rocket for testing raises the question of weapons proliferations in the Third World. What type of cooperation do you see between the First and the Second World in this area?
Well, I think the first problem is to get the full cooperation of the Soviet Union so that we and the Soviets can approach countries like Iraq with a common position about the desirability of limiting the development of long-range missiles by those countries. And we've been talking to the Soviets about them, and I think made some progress. But it's not an easy task to get the Iraqis to agree to abandon a missile system that they put a lot of work into. But I'm clear that that should be our policy. That's what we should be trying to do. I don't know any other approach to it.
A somewhat surprising statement occurred at Malta to the effect that suddenly the administration was interested in negotiating on joint global environmental problem protocols with the Soviet Union. What, in your view, are the prospects for active cooperation in that sphere?
Well, I think our problem is if we are to give leadership in the environmental field, we've got to be willing ourselves to do things that cost money. And we've got budgetary problems. And I think there are people who are reluctant to see us go down that route while our budgetary problems are so intense. And I don't quite know how you can go down the route of taking leadership in the environmental field without being willing to spend some money on it. So that those are the problems that face us, I believe.
In your view, to what extent should the United States base any future agreements with the Soviet Union on the resumption of regional conflicts in the Third World?
Well, I think we have made some progress with the Soviet Union with respect to the subject of regional conflicts. It isn't very dramatic, but there's been some success, and I think particularly with respect to Angola, for instance, I think that may turn out all right. I don't know, in Namibia in particular. I think that may turn out to, it looks as though it's moving better than it would have moved otherwise. But when you get to Afghanistan, that's far from having been worked out. But I should think it may be better than it otherwise would have been, except if we hadn't been able to talk to the Russians about it at all. And but there's still so many of these problems: Ethiopia, et cetera, including Cuba, and the problems that the president had to deal with respect to Central America. So that you would have thought that one of the easiest places for the Soviets to economize, to save funds, would have been, for instance, with respect to Cuba. But I guess there, in the case of Cuba, most of the aid that they're giving to Cuba is in the form of military assistance, sending them weapons which today I believe the Soviets have an excess of. So I think they reduce their expenditures by exporting tanks to Cuba, for instance. So the drives aren't quite that clear as to how much they would save by this. I think it's computed that it's costing the Soviets $3 billion or more per annum. But I don't know how much of that is military equipment, which isn't a cash expenditure, and how much of it is their purchases of sugar, which the Soviets need in any case. So if you to look at what the net cost or what the marginal cost, the incremental cost is to the Soviet Union and their aid to Cuba, I don't believe it's probably anywhere near the $3 billion we compute the cost to be.
The balcony.
Ambassador, you've offered some views on the impact on U.S. policy of the apparent changes in ideology in the Soviet Union. I wonder if you could do the same with the apparent failure of reform in China, and also say a few words about what that means in terms of apparently changing political premises and constant strategic premises in that relationship.
Well, of course, the Chinese communists went at their problems somewhat differently than the Soviets did, and they put the first priority upon curing some of their agricultural problems. And they had really very great trust in the agricultural segment of their economy, and they did not find it difficult to delegate to these cooperatives in the agricultural field really very great authority for self-management, so that whole agricultural revolution in China worked well, while it didn't work well in the Soviet Union. And that gave the Chinese very much of a leg up in trying then to do something about the industrial part of their economy. I don't think they've done very well with the industrial part of their economy, in part because they don't trust their own people in their factories and so forth and so on, and they try to run all their factories from the ministries, in the center, and they don't do that well. But so that it's just a different community. But I think that from the ideological standpoint, I think the Chinese communists also feel that there has been a distinct discrediting of the whole theory of communist controls in the world, and that they're up against a different psychological problem, political problem, that they can only now handle by going into complete isolationism, just separating their contact with the rest of the world. But whether they can continue that long or not, I doubt. So I think there's a delayed time bomb in China, I believe, which eventually they'll have to meet.
Due to the continual inner turmoil you project for the Soviet Union, do you think that we can start making significant cuts in the United States defense budget, say, over the next 5 years? How quickly can we start? How much do you think we might be able to cut, if anything?
I think it's too early. I really was surprised at Mr. Cheney's statement that he was doing all his budget review on the judgment that there wasn't any longer any threat in the world. Now, he didn't quite say, he didn't say there's no longer any need for defense means, but he implied that. I think he phrased it, there's no longer any threat. I don't know whether there's a threat or not, but I think there still is a need for military capabilities, and for many of the reasons that I outlined some of those reasons in my remarks. But can one withstand? Everybody wants to reduce military expenditures, good God. So do all our allies. And when I talked about the centrifugal forces in the alliance, this is certainly one of the centrifugal forces that drives the alliance apart. The Germans would certainly like to reduce their draft and their expenditures for forces. So would the British, and so would the Belgians, and so would everybody else. And I think they all now feel that they don't have the grounds for resisting that. So that if all of the NATO countries suddenly decide there isn't any need for military forces, suddenly we may find that we've grasped defeat out of total victory.
Ambassador, if Gorbachev fails, can you give a couple scenarios of what regime you would think would take over, number one? Number two, as some editorials have stated, there might be a more military hardline regime taking over, and if they wanted to send in the troops to East Germany or bring them out of the barracks of 400,000 Soviet soldiers, what would our response be?
Well, I guess the first part of the question might be the most likely to succeed Gorbachev. And there I referred to the extraordinary things that are going on amongst the great Russians, and after all, 52% of the Russian population are great Russians. And I think they feel very bitterly about the better life and the less sacrifice that they think the Georgians, Armenians, Kazakhstanis, and Muslims and so forth and so on have had rather than the Russians. They think that we Russians have supplied 90% of the sacrifices and done most of the work, and while these other people have been on the sidelines and haven't really sacrificed as much as we have. And that what is necessary for us great Russians is to go back and have a point of view of nationalism of our own. And that's why this group called the Pamiat is now growing by leaps and bounds. I gather from people who've been in the Soviet Union recently that they say that if there were an election in the Russian Republic, it would go to the Pamiat, that they'd win in the election. I'm also told that the chief of their top military man, Yatsov, is a leading member of Pamiat. So that it's not clear what kind of a political structure will be the structure which would be able to take power from Mr. Gorbachev. The leading publicist, I'm told, amongst the great Russians today is a man with the extraordinarily familiar name of Rasputin. And he is by far the most popular Russian author of today, I'm told. And he believes that either the Russian Republic should secede from the Soviet Union and become an autocracy. And this, in fact, is the main drive of all his publicity. He comes from Irkutsk. So when you've got that degree of confusion as to what kind of a regime it will be, I find it difficult to make predictions as to, what we're going to have to deal with. It might not be. It'll be different, I'm sure of that. But in what direction and what kind of threats it would present, I think it's too early to say. But what we do know, I think, is that it's uncertain. The uncertainties in the Soviet Union are immense. And when there are uncertainties, this can either offer great opportunities or it can also offer setbacks. And while you're in a position of uncertainty, I wouldn't think that's the time to totally dismantle your capabilities. And so this question is one, how much do you really need in the light of the uncertainties, but also taking account of those things which I think are irreversible. I don't think it's possible for the Russians ever to again to count on any worthwhile military assistance from the Poles or the Hungarians or the Czechs or that part of the world.
Ambassador, if the U.S. should publicly support the Baltic states in their quest for freedom and perhaps secession, as you suggest, and yet be more cautious in supporting the quest of other ethnic groups within the Soviet Union, is this not too a distinction that could be lost upon those other ethnic peoples? And if the Baltic states persist in their quest for freedom and perhaps secession, could this not unleash chaos in the Soviet Union due to those other ethnic peoples' wish for the same treatment?
It could, but I don't think it would be the cause of it. I think the basic cause of the revolution that is taking place this year is that totalitarian communism has fallen into disrespect. And not only by the outside people, but by the people who've been running it in the past. They themselves have lost confidence in it, which I think is the most important part. I don't think the Czechs, for instance, would have gone the way they've gone if they really thought that the Russians and the hardliners in Czechoslovakia had the determination to really do what they would have had the determination to do 3 years ago. But it's because they felt that the people who were running the show had lost confidence in their own ideological approach. And this then causes people to pay little attention to them. Certainly, in the GDR, the Russians have got what? They've got close to 350,000 troops right there in the GDR, which could certainly overpower anybody that would resist them if they, except for the fact that the people in the FRG in the Federal Republic, they have decided that if the Russians were to fire on the Germans in the GDR, they would bring the German military forces in to support them. So there are great dangers that this situation could get out of hand and really result in, could be very dangerous indeed. You know, if you had the Russian forces there fighting the German forces, and this could happen. You know, it's not an unimaginable thing that could happen in the short run. I don't think it will happen, but it could. All I'm saying is uncertainty is a situation full of potential dangers and hopes, but potential dangers as well.
Ambassador, you mentioned the likely destabilizing effects of the Soviets' new SS-18 Mod 5. I'm curious if you feel that some of the United States' new weapon systems, perhaps the B-2 or SDI, potentially have similar destabilizing effects, and if not, what the potential differences are that make you feel that there would not be.
Well, frankly, I don't think it's possible for SDI to be deployed within the foreseeable future. I don't think the technical possibilities have yet been solved in any way, and the law now provides as law what I'd once suggested be the 3 criteria that must be met before we begin the deployment of such a system. And I don't believe that law is going to be changed, because the Congress is adamant about it, and I don't see any prospect, therefore, of SDI being a destabilizing system. But these weapons that I'm talking about, I forget when they deployed the first one, but I think it was perhaps at the beginning, last fall sometime. But it looks now as though they'll get the whole 150 perhaps deployed before the end, sometime in the middle of next year. They're really going at it hammer and tongs. And these weapons, you know, are twice the weight and size and capability of the MX. And they're brand new, much better guidance and much better reliability. And so this really goes to the heart of the security of the United States. I can't imagine a more destabilizing system than this system. SDI is not even a prospect for a long period of time.
Oh.
Yes, I'm wondering if you were the current President of the United States, what your public response would be to the events in Europe, and particularly in Germany, and how does that differ from what President Bush is doing?
Well, I didn't quite get the first part of the question.
If you were president, how would you respond?
That's an impossible assumption, but but if I were president, how I would respond to
current events in Europe, and particularly inter-German relations.
Well, I tried to lay out my response to all the questions that I could think of, you know, in my prepared remarks. And,
would you have any specific comments on what you would do differently from what President Bush is doing?
Well, I don't know that he's contemplating doing all the things that I suggested in my remarks. No, I think there were about 20 or 30 different issues which I tried to address in my remarks as to how I would come down on these controversial issues. And I don't know that those are the positions that Mr. Bush will come down on, but you know, I don't know.
Balcony.
I wonder if you might come back to the question for a moment about reduction in U.S. defense expenditures overall, the so-called peace dividend. Our country itself, our Congress, is not without its differences, just as is the case in other parts of the world, and there'll be many of those in Congress as well as in the cities and other areas who will press for that reduction sooner rather than later. And I wonder how you think the debate in Congress will unfold along that line.
I'm very poor at guessing in advance what the Congress is going to do. I'm just not very good at it. I know, you know, I tend to address myself to what I would do if I were in the Congress. And if I were the Congress, I would not want to go too deeply now into reductions until I had a greater feel as to how this is going to work out. And I think we'll know a hell of a lot more about it within a year than we do today, and certainly more than that in 2 years. But I know we're going to have to make some cuts right away, and just on general budgetary grounds. And those are going to go forward, and I would not try to reverse them. But I wouldn't go for deep cuts at this time. Congress may decide to do that, but that wouldn't be my view.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Ambassador, a quick question about East-West arms control as a process. From talking with people at the diplomatic academy in Moscow and just reading the constant initiatives coming from the East, is perhaps the West's style of negotiation too ponderous for this new era? Are there new processes or new formulas for developing negotiating approaches that could add to progress in arms control that is not being taken now?
Well, frankly, I'm not in great admiration of what they call their flexibility. They're the least flexible people to negotiate with I've ever seen. They're great at propaganda. They're great at...
What do you see as the role of the United Nations in the development of relations in Europe, more specifically?
I continue to believe that the real problem here is a problem between the U.S. and the USSR, and the United Nations can't do much except to provide a forum. And they have done that for a long period of time. Most of the negotiations, certainly all the multilateral negotiations which we conducted with the Soviet Union were under the aegis of the UN. So to provide a forum, yes. But when it comes to the actual negotiations between the USSR and ourselves, all the START agreements and so forth and so on, the UN has had very little to do with that. Now, with respect to chemical warfare, for instance, that is wholly under the aegis of the UN, and that's being done in one of the committees of the UN. And I forget what the name of the committee is. The Committee for Disarmament, yeah. And so there are things where it is the right forum. But I think it would be quite unwise for the Secretary of General himself, for instance, to take a role in the negotiations. Wouldn't do any good and wouldn't help.
Sir, the changes in the East have caused consternation, I'm sure, among many foreign policy analysts and military people and folks like that who have, in many cases, based their careers on the Soviet threat and the need to react to it. And I believe there's a front-page editorial in The Nation a couple of months ago which raised the specter of Cold War nostalgia among some of these people. Do you think that sort of thing is realistic, or do you think that that's not the case?
Well, I haven't run into anybody who would like to go back to the situation as it was last year, even. No, it's... would you like to? Is there anybody who would like to undo the freedom of Poland, freedom of the GDR, which is almost there, the Czechoslovakia? Would you like to put them back where they were? I don't know of any such people who are nostalgic for that.
This side.
Ambassador, in view of our budget deficit, how much aid would we be able to give Russia, and what would that aid be?
Well, frankly, I'm against our deficit. I think we ought to, I don't agree with the president. I'm sorry. I think we ought to welcome an increase in taxes. I know that the Democrats, I'm a Democrat, would try to spend it all on, have the dividend all for their programs. But I still believe that most of it should go toward reducing the deficit. And I should think that the best way of doing it would be to put an excise tax on gasoline and oil products and so forth and so on, a large one, because I think that would be taking it away from the Arabs rather than from ourselves, because there's a certain price that can be obtained for oil and oil products today, and it depends who gets what part of it, and I think we ought to get a larger part, and the Arabs ought to get less, so that I'm all for this. But, and that isn't, still may be somewhat, unegalitarian but I think it won't be that much. I mean, I think it'll help everybody. But those are my present views. I mean, those are my views. Now, you asked the question, how much could we afford to contribute to the Soviet Union if we decided so do? Well, after all, our economy is a 5 trillion economy. And I guess if one considered giving them, 5 billion a year, let's say, that's what percentage of 5 trillion? I guess it's 1,000, isn't it? 1/10 of 1%? And I think it's de minimis. So clearly you can do something which amounts to 1,000th of your, 1/10 of 1% of your gross national product. It means the problems that you got now will be very slightly worse. Certainly it isn't the kind of thing you want to do, is to just exacerbate your monetary and budgetary problems. But you can do it. Depends what you want to do.
Last question.
Mr. Ambassador, you compare the current situation to the earlier era in which Europe was on the verge of tremendous change. It strikes me that one of the assets we had in our policy process at that earlier time was men such as yourself, Kennan, Atchison, who not only had a vision of the future, but also were articulate enough that they could express that vision so it commanded policy support. More of a plea than a question. Where are the comparable articulate visionaries of today?
Well, I think they do exist. And, part of the problem is with the press. The press don't pick anybody up until, it becomes fashionable to pick them up. But there are a lot of very good people that are contributing to this process at lower ranks throughout the government. And, some of those, including, others than myself really, back in the 40s, got real publicity from what they were doing because they were in position. They were in a very favorable period, as I described that period in February 1947, where suddenly there was a unity in our people and in the Congress to go forward and do these great things. Then, if you happen to be in the right position, you got great publicity and you looked like a great man, even though you weren't necessarily any greater man than some of the people who haven't succeeded in their ventures. So that I don't really buy the theory that somehow or other Lovett and Harriman had some unique capabilities which you can't find today. I think you can find people who've got greater capabilities inherent than they did today, but they were in an era where it was easier to get some of these things done. And they grabbed the opportunity, or they were given the opportunity to do these things, and they did them. And they turned out to be very successful. And some of these other people have not had the opportunities and have not been given as much credit as they deserve, in my opinion.
Paul, I just want to say that once again, as in many previous years, we're in your debt, and we hope that this will become an annual debt as an event at the Kennedy School. So thank you very much.